Silicon Valley in California. From here, companies like Apple and Google have conquered the world, but their success has come at a price.
Yeah, there's not much to see. It's just people, oh, you're from Los Altos, oh, you must be very wealthy. Well, I was living in Los Altos before it became, this very exclusive area to live.
David is a tradesman. The rise of tech companies has made it impossible to pay rent. For 3 years, he's been living in a van right next to Google's campus.
Partially, there's reasons why there's jobs here. I was living in a house. It was a 2-bedroom house. I was paying about $2,400 a month. I was doing okay. Well, the guy realizes he can get $5,000 a month for this place, right? So he tells me, you got to go when the lease is up. I'm going to remodel. And so people like me, like I've been here my whole life, I got nowhere to go.
Silicon Valley and San Francisco belong to the Bay Area. As of 2021, there are around 35,000 homeless people here, alongside the highest density of billionaires in the world. And the pandemic has only exacerbated that inequality.
It really precludes any possibility of us having a meaningful democracy when some people in our community have not only their basic needs assured, but every conceivable object of opulence, and other people can't even survive. I think that exposes that our pretense of democracy in this country is something of a farce.
Facebook, Google, Amazon, and Apple have changed the global economy. Have they become too big in the process? Politicians seem to want to limit the company's power.
The purpose of today's hearing is to examine the dominance of Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google.
In fact,
Tech bosses have been called to testify before Congress.
The tech industry is an American success story. The products we build have changed the world and improved people's lives.
Google aims to build products that increase access to opportunity for everyone, no matter where you live, what you believe, or how much money you earn.
Tech companies don't see their marketplace power as a problem.
One of the biggest problems that Silicon Valley leaders have is that they believe that because their intentions are good, that the outcomes will be good. And that it's really hard for them to imagine that despite their good efforts, some things have gone completely down the drain.
Davos, Switzerland. This is where the world's most powerful people gather for the World Economic Forum. In January 2019, the coronavirus pandemic was still a long way off. A Dutch historian put his finger on the problem.
1,500 private jets flown in here. And I hear people talk in the language of participation and justice and equality and transparency. But then, almost no one raises the real issue of tax avoidance, right? Come on, we gotta be talking about taxes. Yeah, exactly. That's it, taxes, taxes, taxes. All the rest is bullshit, in my opinion.
The fact is that more and more of our world belongs to a few super rich people. One reason for that is tax avoidance. Between 2014 and 2018, billionaire Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos paid an effective tax rate of 0.98%. Compare that to the top U.S. tax rate of almost 40%. For economic historian Adam Tooze, the problem is systemic.
They're also drivers of inequality at the top. If you look at the income distribution in American society, a very key element of the surge of the wealth and income of the top 1% is not just people on Wall Street, it's the senior managerial elite and their technicians in these companies who have very big stock options, very handsome compensation, and then they get bonuses on top. So these successful companies distort and drive increasing polarization in American society.
The coronavirus has exacerbated the trend. Between 2020 and 2022, while many Americans were losing their jobs, Jeff Bezos' fortune grew by more than $80 billion.
The standard story that we've always been told about the creation of wealth is that it is created at the top, right, by these brilliant entrepreneurs and innovators. And then
that'll trickle down to the rest of us, right? And sure, we can tax them, but we also got to be grateful. And we shouldn't tax them too much because that may, disincentivize all their great work. What we've come to realize, maybe especially because of the pandemic, is that actually it's the other way around. The real wealth creators that we're really dependent on are the plumbers, the teachers, the nurses, the care workers, you name it. If they stop working, society crumbles.
Tax avoidance has led tech companies to rural areas, far from the big cities. In remote Prineville, Oregon, Facebook has invested $2 billion in a data center.
This was a very sleepy city prior to the tech companies coming in. This is the county seat. It's also the oldest seat in Crook County, but economically it was pretty stagnant before the data companies came in.
In 2009, Facebook was lured here with the promise of tax breaks. As of 2021, the city has lost a potential $130 million in taxes. Is the deal fair? In 2020 alone, Facebook generated nearly $30 billion in profit.
If they didn't show up here, we wouldn't have a lot of the infrastructure we have. We wouldn't have a lot of the cool programs that, that they've helped out with the schools. We would still be that small town struggling to find an industry to come here after the early 90s timber industry shut down.
Closing sawmills saw Prineville's unemployment rate rise to about 20%. Then came Facebook. But in 2022, the data center employed only about 350 people. Instead of taxes, Facebook makes donations to the town for things like school renovations, courses in programming, and infrastructure. Does that make Prineville's politicians susceptible to influence?
I think
they're starting
some
to.
Are
I think they're starting to.
Why?
Because they know they'll get money from them. They know they'll help support some of the projects and things that the economy itself can't afford to do.
They're more powerful than the government. I mean, they really are. And I don't know where or how, from a legislative point of view, you can interact with something that you can't anticipate. And that's a problem.
Facebook is opening its 11th data center on the site in 2023. The facility will soon have an area of 4 million square meters. The company confirms that it has given out $3 million in voluntary grants.
Yes, Facebook has a huge presence here. And yes, a lot of people work up there, but I don't think, yes, we're a Facebook city, and the fact that we're one of their partners and we've worked closely with them to build like they have, but I think our identity still is a timber town.
Facebook's tax break in Prineville won't end until 2027. Only then will the town find out whether its deal with the company was a good one. It isn't just small towns that have to negotiate with tech giants. Entire countries depend on them. How did individual companies get so big? One answer takes us back to 2007, the start of the financial crisis and the soaring fortunes of financial services firm BlackRock. As the banking sector faltered, then Federal Reserve Chair Timothy Geithner allowed BlackRock to oversee the winding down and restructuring of banks.
So come the financial crisis, you have to, for instance, rapidly dismantle a bank like Bear Stearns. Who do you ask to do it for you? Well, you don't really want expertise in the Federal Reserve of New York to have its hands too dirty. You'd rather contract this out, and you find people who really know their way around this, like BlackRock, for instance, at the time, a relatively unknown company, but with huge expertise.
BlackRock closed banks and bought up ailing financial institutions. It became the first big winner of the crisis. By 2020, the group was managing assets worth $9 trillion.
And then, crucially, it becomes a predator. So it becomes an entity that has the ready cash to buy other people's assets as they look for capital.
BlackRock also struck in Europe, advising the European Central Bank and buying up a share of major British bank Barclays in 2009.
And BlackRock uses the embarrassment of Barclays to pounce on this portfolio and dismantle it and incorporate it into BlackRock's business. And it jumps BlackRock away from its major competitors at the time, Schwab and Vanguard, and pushes BlackRock into a much bigger league.
So help you God, so help me God.
In an effort to prop up failing banks, U.S. Presidents Bush and Obama pumped massive amounts of cheap money into the system, buying stock in the banks with state capital.
If you delay acting on an economy of this severity, then you potentially create a negative spiral that becomes much more difficult for us to get out of.
The whole strategy in early 2009 is to prevent the avalanche rolling again. That's the key, right? You can do work creation, you can do stimulus, you can begin to repair American society with a healthcare program, but you can only do any of that if you stop the banks falling.
The financial system didn't collapse. The U.S. economy began to recover, in part because investment capital was so cheap. One man especially took clever advantage of that fact: Jeff Bezos. Economics professor Scott Galloway has analyzed the rise of Amazon.
People forget, in the early 2000s, a lot of smart analysts thought that Amazon was going to face a liquidity crisis and could go out of business. And their stock underperformed for the better part of a decade.
Bezos focused on spending revenue and easily gotten capital on the optimization of his supply chain. The goal was to make products reach the customer faster.
It's easy to put up a website, but it's hard to make it really good, and it's hard to make sure that the stuff arrives in good condition, on time.
What's unusual about Amazon is it's not a victory of marketing, it's not a victory of innovation, really. It's a victory of supply chain. They have managed to get more products to more people faster than anyone else in the world.
Amazon is one of the most valuable companies in the world, along with Apple, Google, and Facebook. As of September 2021, they're worth together around $7 trillion.
If you show up with more capital than your competitors, the odds are you're going to win. So access to cheap capital is important and has become a key strategy for the winners.
At Amazon, growth is everything. Employees are monitored. Forming a union is difficult. There are 2 million Amazon retailers that depend on the giant for their survival, much like Jörg Hubacher.
Our whole business model is aligned with Amazon. Without Amazon, we wouldn't exist. Amazon is basically our lifeline.
Amazon takes care of storage, shipping, and returns for Jörg Hubacher. In return, it takes commission. For every euro of sales, Hubacher has to hand over 30 cents to Amazon. In 2019, Amazon made almost $60 billion from these commissions alone.
Problem is, people will say, well, it's a two-sided trade. The retailers don't have to work with Amazon. And I would argue that's not really true. Amazon is now 50% of all e-commerce. So to not be on Amazon is really to not have an e-commerce offering. And that just isn't an option for most people.
Germany's Online Trade Association has surveyed almost 1,000 retailers about their experience with Amazon. Nearly 80% of respondents saw Amazon as a difficult partner that dictated prices and encouraged dependency on the platform. In May 2021, Amazon cut Hubacher's inventory. Half of his products were removed, resulting in a six-figure loss in turnover.
You don't sleep very well when suddenly the foundation of your business is taken away, and you have to put all of your employees on reduced hours overnight with no notice. That's not something you can prepare for. A switch gets flipped, and then suddenly you're virtually out of business.
Responding to an inquiry, Amazon gave the pandemic as the reason for its actions. Warehouses were overcrowded, and hygiene measures had changed its logistics procedures.
If these inventory caps go on for another 2 months, I'll have to close down. I wouldn't survive because the overhead costs keep running. I have 35 employees here whom I have to pay.
Amazon didn't pay compensation. Hubacher had to bear the loss in turnover on his own. Meanwhile, Amazon founder Jeff Bezos was flying into space in his own rocket.
The tower, on our way to space with our first human crew.
The market power of big tech firms also stems from buying up other companies, both inside and outside their own sector. They purchase hundreds of competitors. Then they either use the newly acquired technology or bury it. Apple Park in Silicon Valley, the headquarters of another tech giant. Apple was founded in 1976 with starting capital of just 1,300 US. In 2022, it's the most valuable company in the world, with a stock market value of around $3 trillion. Much of its profit coming from the App Store. Founder Steve Jobs presented it in 2008 as a platform for selling software. Apple has sold nearly 2 billion iPhones worldwide. The success of software can depend on its presence in the App Store, for which Apple charges 15 to 30% of revenue. David Heinemeier Hansson can't accept that. The entrepreneur lives in Malibu, California. He became famous in tech circles with his Basecamp software.
And essentially tell us, if you don't like the deal, you can just get out of here. You can just shut down your business. How is that a choice? It just felt like mafia tactics. Even the way they showed up to demand the money was just despicable.
Heinemeier Hansson wanted to distribute his new email software without paying huge commissions.
And pretty soon it's 30% of the whole economy, and pretty soon you're like, why is it 30%, not 40%? Maybe we should just raise our prices. This is a captive audience nonetheless, which is exactly the essence of monopoly power.
Other companies are also taking action against Apple's commission. In 2019, Spotify sued in Europe, prompting the European Commission to initiate antitrust proceedings. In the US, game developer Epic Games also filed an antitrust complaint in 2020. Apple's CEO Tim Cook had to defend himself in court.
This isn't about destroying Apple. This isn't about destroying anyone. This is about giving us all a chance and access to the market.
The tech companies decide under what conditions others can enter their system. In the process, they collect oceans of data. Facebook holding company Meta alone has a total of 3 billion users, thanks to its acquisitions of WhatsApp and Instagram. Shoshana Zuboff, an author and professor emerita at Harvard, calls it surveillance capitalism.
They invade our private lives through surveillance. They extract from our lives, rendering what they extract as behavioral data, and then they claim those behavioral data as their private property. That's how surveillance capitalism works. This is a fundamentally illegitimate operation.
The data is used to advertise products and for political campaigns.
Surveillance capitalism became the dominant economic paradigm. And it went from Google to Facebook. From Facebook, it became the default option in the tech sector. It reset the bar for investors because with the surveillance dividend, you produce more revenue more quickly than, doing capitalism the old-fashioned way, which is actually creating products and services that meet people's real needs.
Marietje Schaake from the Netherlands is a former member of the European Parliament. She's now International Policy Director of Stanford University's Cyber Policy Center.
My sense is that one of the biggest problems that Silicon Valley leaders have is that they believe that because their intentions are good, that the outcomes will be good. And that it's really hard for them to imagine that despite their good efforts, some things have gone completely down the drain.
Schaake and Zuboff are part of a panel of experts that want to keep an eye on Facebook. Meanwhile, activists have placed body bags outside Facebook's Washington office. They see the company's role in election interference and misinformation as deadly, especially during the pandemic.
Even if you may think, well, selling ads is not, life-threatening, it can lead to dynamics that are life-threatening, with micro-targeting, with the going viral of hatred, with people taking to the streets because they actually believe that the election was stolen. If you design the architecture for data and information with profit goals, that those become dominant and that have been out of sight, even if society pays the price.
Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg has testified before investigative committees several times, like here in the US Senate in 2018.
My top priority has always been our social mission of connecting people, building community, and bringing the world closer together.
The US government has been pursuing several cases against the tech giants in the early 2020s. The Federal Trade Commission is suing Facebook for creating a monopoly. The Department of Justice is suing Google. The House of Representatives is even considering breaking up the companies, so far without much success.
So I think things have flipped. And now our innovators and our tech companies believe that they, in fact, have the upper hand and more resources and are more powerful than the government that's supposed to regulate them.
Are big tech corporations more powerful than nations? For Ramesh Srinivasan of the University of California, that's a crucial question.
Who is influencing how we feel, what we believe, what we think, who we connect with, what we know? Right? There's no question that that's occurring far more intensely and ubiquitously, the governance of our lives, by a private tech company, a Google search results, Facebook's feeds, etc. Right?
And I think the awareness of the harms of putting so much trust and responsibility in the hands of retail and advertising companies was a mistake. It really was a big mistake. And I think it's important that democratic governments start to use technology to advance their own democratic agendas and not have tech companies use them to advance their own corporate agendas.
Many critics are hopeful the EU will curb the power of tech giants. 2 new directives from 2020 are expected to get things started. The Digital Service Act, or DSA, aims to ensure that platforms like Facebook and Twitter take on more responsibility when it comes to things like deleting illegal content and maintaining transparency and fundamental rights. The Digital Markets Act, DMA, defines fair competition rules. Put simply, allowing competition and sharing data. Amazon, Apple, and Google would be affected by the directives. European Commissioner for Competition, Margrethe Vestager, is taking companies to task.
With that size also comes responsibility. And then line up what you have to do and what you cannot do.
Facebook and its fellow rivals are fighting the planned regulations with help from lobbyists. In 2020 alone, US tech companies spent around 100 million euros on political influence in Brussels. They hired ex-politicians with the best connections. Facebook even employs a former British Deputy Prime Minister, Nick Clegg.
Da existiert auf jeden Fall ein Ungleichgewicht.
There's definitely an imbalance. The big tech companies have a lot of resources. As members of the European Parliament, we have very small teams with 3 or 4 employees in Brussels who write policy. It's clear that as an individual MEP, you can't compete with the lobbying power the big tech companies have, or their resources.
Rasmus Andresen represents the Greens in the European Parliament. He receives weekly requests for talks from lobbyists. This time, it's a representative from Amazon.
Amazon just wants to push its interests. I think they'll try to give us suggestions on how to water down the law so it doesn't affect them, or doesn't change anything at the core of their business model.
Lobbying isn't illegal, but is it legitimate? Andreas Schwab represents the center-right CDU in the European Parliament. As well as under their own names, large corporations exert influence covertly through trade associations.
They come to you as the first European Association of American Companies. Then they come as the European Association of Digital Companies. Then the European Association of Tech Companies. Then the American Business Association. Then the American Business Association for Tech Companies. They come and they come and they come. At some point, as a member of Parliament, you have to ask how much time you can spend on their concerns. Shouldn't we be spending much more time on the concerns of other citizens and businesses?
Lobbying is used to put pressure on undesired regulation. And if that doesn't work, there's a longer legal route. The European Commission is proposing creating 80 positions to enforce the rules. But Apple's legal department alone has a total of 900 employees.
Of course, we cannot compete when it comes to the funding of lobbyism. We cannot compete when it comes to the number of lawyers. So, what we have to put into the process is, of course, a dedication to get this right.
Google, Facebook, and Apple also put large sums into lobbying in the US. When the software developer David Heinemeier Hansson decided to fight Apple's market power in 2021, he found out how strong that pressure is in several US states.
When I testified in front of the Arizona House, and the chairwoman of that committee said, as her opening statement for the proceedings, that Apple had bought every lobbyist in town, and that before the hearing had even had a chance to happen, Apple had tried to squash it.
To do this, the company hired lobbyist Kirk Adams, a former chief of staff to Arizona Governor Doug Ducey. The planned law would have enabled app providers to circumvent Apple's high commissions. Arizona would have been the first state to crack down on the monopoly.
In fact, I was sitting on a Zoom call for that final meeting, and we were waiting to deliver our testimony, and then in the middle of the proceedings, they simply said, oh, actually, we're not even going to hear this bill. Something has come up, it's no longer the agenda. And you witness that and you think, is this a movie?
There was no vote. Instead, a deal was struck behind closed doors. The law that would have endangered Apple's market power was thwarted. A similar regulation also failed in North Dakota in 2021.
So that was really just frightening to see up front that power, as being conjured by this monopoly success, gives you the resources to squash democratic accountability. That when sovereign states like North Dakota and Arizona are not even powerful enough to hear a bill, to bring it to a final vote, yikes.
When asked about what happened, Apple admitted exerting influence, but defended its actions, saying this legislation threatens to destroy this very successful model, as well as the privacy and security mechanisms our customers expect. Is the power of global megacorporations a danger to democracy?
One of the steps to tyranny was when private power overran government. Government is supposed to represent our best interests and be a counterbalance or a ballast to private power that will always pursue profits and ignore the externalities, whether it's teen depression or misinformation or weaponization of our elections. And there are more full-time lobbyists working for Amazon living in Washington, D.C. than there are sitting U.S. senators. The PR and communications department of Facebook spinning their image is now bigger than the newsroom at the Washington Post.
Relations between Silicon Valley and Washington are close.
We are in the middle of the worst.
Google was a top donor to Barack Obama's 2012 election campaign.
Workers have lost their jobs so far.
In the United States, corporations can essentially buy elections. The system is corrupted, so the system itself has to be transformed as well on the level of who influences our publicly elected politicians.
Liège, Belgium. Alibaba, China's answer to Amazon, plans to open a distribution center here in November 2021. but the project is facing resistance from some locals.
China is a superpower. It advocates for its interests on a global scale, including through companies like Alibaba in strategic sectors. We're looking at a Chinese expansion project here.
Liège is a stop on the New Silk Road, China's major 21st century infrastructure project. The deal was brokered in 2018 by Belgium's King Philip, seen here with Jack Ma, founder of Alibaba. The closeness between state and company is typical for China, says digital expert Kai von Carnap.
It's increased significantly in the last year because of the expansion of so-called party cells. Party cells are effectively Communist Party representatives installed within various private sector corporations, but especially in the tech sector.
Party functionaries are also working within Alibaba. Profit and politics combine to serve the party. Wallonia's former finance minister doesn't see any danger in the situation.
I don't want to be an advocate for authoritarian states. Global trade is a reality, and I prefer for exchange to take place between democratic countries. But I'm not naive. I don't believe we live in a world where we're essentially good and only good. That would be wonderful, but it's not the reality.
Is it simply online trade or Chinese imperialism? After the decline of the steel industry in the 2010s, Liège's unemployment rate was high. Is Belgium happy to pay any price for economic growth?
For 30 or 40 years, we've been swindled by the multinationals. Until now, it was mostly US companies. Now we're going to try it with the Chinese. They're taking advantage of the fact that we have high unemployment and are desperate for foreign investors.
In 2021, 2 of the top 10 tech companies were Chinese. Another could soon join them. ByteDance, the parent company of TikTok, known as Douyin in Chinese. The platform, known for short videos, has raced ahead of the US competition thanks to a successful recipe.
They were able to improve the algorithm based on a much better understanding of our online behavior. China has an insanely large online community and low digital privacy. That's led to an algorithm that's significantly better at recognizing what we want to watch next.
TikTok has only been on the worldwide market since 2018, but has already been downloaded over 2 billion times, more frequently than Facebook and WhatsApp. The Chinese state also has its place at the helm of parent company ByteDance, controlling data and censoring content.
There's a catalog of sensitive issues around domestic questions. Tiananmen Square, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, and Taiwan are all sensitive topics that are not allowed to be spread through TikTok or the Chinese equivalent. These policies exist in Europe and the US too. There was an example a few months ago where a user tried to criticize human rights violations in Xinjiang under the premise of a makeup video. It was exposed within a few days and taken down.
How much influence does the Communist Party have on TikTok? The company stresses that it complies with local laws. But when questioned about it, the Chinese government won't answer if it has access to the data of TikTok users. Fear is growing in Beijing about the power of China's own tech companies. In April 2021, Alibaba had to pay 2.3 billion euros in fines after an antitrust case. At ByteDance, the state has bought company shares. The regime has been tightening the screws on the tech market since late 2020 and is looking into banning certain business models.
I think China looks at the US and Europe and says, these governments have been overrun by big tech, and we're not going to get to this point. And they've made some very swift, aggressive actions against big tech, saying, when big tech overruns government, as it has in the US and Europe, it leads to very bad places.
Meanwhile, in Nevada, a company is working towards doing business completely independent of local laws. Here in the desert near Reno, tech companies are hoping to found their own city. The model comes courtesy of cryptocurrency firm Blockchains LLC. Chief Executive Jeffrey Burns wants to create so-called innovation zones, acting like completely independent local governments. Burns donated money to Nevada Governor Steve Sisolak and hired influential lobbyists. A few months after backroom talks in early 2021, the governor announced a bill. Journalist Sam Metz has been covering the story.
So under the innovation zones, as it was proposed, any tech company with a certain amount of land that promised a certain amount of investment could apply with the state to create an innovation zone, which would give them the powers akin to local government.
The condition is that tech companies invest at least $1.25 billion US. In return, they're allowed to introduce their own local tax, judicial, and school systems. So is sovereignty up for sale?
I think the story of Nevada is really the story of politicians trying to diversify a single industry economy. So first it was mining, then it was gambling and tourism, and now I think the pandemic has really made the state aware that it's hard to just rely on one industry.
The pandemic has hit Nevada hard. The governor is hoping for a cash injection from Blockchains LLC.
I think in Nevada, critics are worried about actors with enough resources to buy land, hire lobbyists, and get an audience with the governor.
Why does Jeffrey Burns want to eliminate local governments? Our requests for an interview went unanswered. Only his security advisor was available.
I think that there are ways we can incentivize places that have suffered a lot to be investment hubs for businesses, but I don't think it has to mean that they're given all this power to basically become like their own states. That's a violation on many different levels of sovereignty, of like state-based sovereignty. I mean, that to me sounds like some sort of like District 9 or some sort of, or like RoboCop, some kind of dystopic sci-fi.
After heavy criticism, the bill was withdrawn in August 2021. Governor Steve Sisolak and Blockchains LLC are holding on to their idea, however, to sell the powers of state to tech corporations. Meanwhile, in Washington, the fight against the market dominance of Google, Apple, Facebook, and others continues. Congress is relying primarily on antitrust laws.
Simply put, they have too much power. This power.
But how promising are these proceedings? Legal expert Chris Sagers is skeptical.
Personally, I think the risk with even very aggressive antitrust is not so much that it will wreck anything. It's just that whatever good it does won't be permanent. And what I fear is, we may have this period of a few years of very aggressive intervention, and even though it seems unlikely, perhaps the government will manage to break up Google or Facebook or some other firm. And then it will only be a matter of a few years before somebody else figures out how to make a new monopoly out of it.
President Joe Biden has shown a willingness for the fight, but he's had to compromise.
Democrats are in control of both houses of Congress and the White House, but in the Senate, it will be very difficult to adopt any legislation that doesn't have some Republican support, and Republicans will be very much against any very serious change.
Sagers estimates that proceedings in the U.S. will take years. Cyber expert Maritza Shaka prefers action on a global scale.
It begins with awareness about the extent to which the outsized power of tech companies, whether they're big or small, the entire ecosystem, harms democracy. It's something that really has to be understood. So it will have to be a combination of mechanisms to make sure that that gets rebalanced back to putting democracy first and not putting technology first.
Shoshana Zuboff is calling for a ban on the business model of Facebook and others. That is, collecting and selling user data.
So we take aim at extraction. We make those operations illegal, the amplification of divisive content for profit, the amplification of hate for profit, the amplification of lies for profit that kills. We make it illegal.
Zuboff believes that the relevant laws are already in place. They just need to be adapted to the digital age.
An incredibly important part of our global community.
We've also gone after markets, right? And we've said in democracies, we've long said, you can't trade in human beings. You can't trade in human organs. You can't trade in babies. You can't trade in illicit drugs. You can't trade in things that make people sick or products that are dangerous. We've done that countless times. Now it's just applying it to our reality, in our era, in our time, in our digital century.
The uncontrolled power of megacorporations and the growing gap between rich and poor. The two go hand in hand, according to historian Rutger Bregman.
When was capitalism working, for most people in the best way? Well, in the 50s and the 60s. They had taxes up to 80, 90% for the richest people, right? Worked perfectly well. We had the highest economic growth we've ever seen and the highest rates of innovation. For many people who are sort of, 50 years old or 60 years old, they think, oh, that's communism, that can never work. If you study history, you'll see that it can actually work.
Greed for profit, new technology, and big politics. Together they create an opaque world, one which each new generation will likely have to struggle to bring under control.
About people's liberties here. We have Mr. Jordan, you made a unanimous consent request. Objection was heard. Those are our rules.